So let's go into lots of detail here because there's actually a lot of things going on and I didn't really have a good chance to analyze everything in the game. It went by really fast. And in fact, there are a lot of things that I think I'm going to realize as I try and work these things out, and they're going to hopefully be pretty useful. So we're starting off the game as the dealer, and starting the game as dealer is really good. It's like it's an extra boost to your chance to win just for free. Your opponent needs to either score something really big to catch up with your positional edge, or you have to completely miss on your hand and your hand as pwn in order to not make your first milestone, which is at roughly 18. So when we look at our hand now and see ace 4-4 jack, that's a nice combo for 6 points, we're feeling pretty good because not only is that 6 points, we get to throw away 6-7, which is connected and makes lots of points on 8 that our opponent might throw away. Our ace 4-4 jack also improves to 10 points a lot whenever we cut a 10. So looking at this hand, I think there's no way to really, well, the only thing that you could sort of argue for is maybe keeping 4-4-6-7, maybe. It keeps 4 points and it also improves massively whenever you cut a 5. But cutting a 5 is always pretty good for you as dealer because your opponent's probably going to be throwing away a 10, and in this case we're going to be throwing away 6-7 anyway, which combos with the 5s that would be cut. So don't need to worry about that, and so don't need to keep 4-4-6-7 in order to capitalize on any 5 cuts. So with that in mind, we throw away the 6-7 and we cut a 9, which is not the best. It combos with the 6 that we throw away, and potentially if our opponent had thrown away an 8, our crib is worth at least 8 points. But that seems unlikely when our opponent leads an 8, and this is the first moment that we have to think. And the time that I had in the game definitely wasn't enough to really understand the situation. So one thing that we need to understand is what kind of hands does our opponent have here most often? What is our opponent's range? And the way that you usually answer that is to think about what are the hands that are worth the most number of points. And in this case, the hands that are worth the most number of points, and usually you want to think about them sort of from your opponent's point of view, where they don't necessarily know what the top card is. Of course, when we get around to making our decision, we do know what the cut is, and we get to work out which hands in our opponent's range we want to be playing against in particular. So, when our opponent leads an 8, what's the most common and highest scoring hands that contain an 8? Well, this is a nice easy one. The highest scoring hands that contain an 8 that you can keep with 4 cards are the double runs that include 2 7s and an 8, or 2 8s and a 7. Those are worth 12 points at least, and when we see the 9 cut, they jump up to being worth anywhere between 16 points and 24 points in the worst case scenario. So for instance, if our opponent's hand is exactly 7 7 8 8, then their hand is now worth 24 points because of the 9. And on the other hand, if our opponent's hand was something like 6 6 7 8, then with the 9 cut, it's now worth 16. All hands that are really worth knowing. But what else could be in our opponent's hand when they lead an 8? Well, not only do we get a peek as to one of the cards in our opponent's hand, we get to know that this is the card that they want to lead out of the others. So it could mean their opponent has cards like 5s in their hand, so something like 5 5 2 8. That's worth 6 points, and you might very well lead the 8 in such situations because you don't want to lead the 5, and maybe you think that the 2, if it just gets paired, it leaves you in a bad position anyway, and you want to get things moving with an 8. Seems very reasonable. So other cards maybe that are another thing that might be worth thinking is that maybe it means our opponent has a second 8. So if our opponent has 2 8s, then they might play out one of them because it doesn't really change the playability of their hand. The number of different cards that they have in their hand is still going to be the same when they unpair their 8. Also, the other thing about a pair of 8s in the hand is that it's very rare to get a scenario where your opponent says go and you get to play one of your 8s on top of the other and get a pair. So undoubling your 8s is a fairly common thing to do. In fact, the only things that you probably don't undouble quickly are things like aces, 2s, sometimes 3s. It's also sometimes you can do 4s, but people really like to undouble their 4s early. Probably it's quite unbalanced what people do. Anyway, what does this mean about what we should be playing from our hand? Well, what's the texture of our hand? The texture means, so what do we have? Lots of high cards, low cards, mid cards. In this case, we've got a good spread. We've got an ace and a jack, so we've got high and a very low, but we're a little bit concentrated on the low end. We've got 2 4s, so we'll eventually want to undouble our 4s, and considering that our opponent probably has, a lot of aces, 2s, 3s a lot of the time, it's very unlikely for us to play out our 4s on top of each other to get a pair on the play. So when we look at our decisions here, a couple of things stand out to us. I think the first thing that we can all agree on is that it's completely a mistake to play the ace. And why is that? Well, you never play the ace here because your opponent has 6s. And why does your opponent have 6s? Well, it's because of the range that we discussed earlier. So our opponent is their highest scoring hands definitely contain things like 6, 7, 8, and because that's very high scoring, their range contains a lot of that particular hand. And we want to avoid giving points to those particular hands, because even if our opponent is scoring 16 in their hand, we're still beating them in some sense. We're still sort of positionally ahead even if our opponent gets 1/16. It takes a lot in order to overcome the sort of disadvantage of having first pawn. Now, it definitely happens, and if our opponent has 16 points, they're well on their way to taking a very early lead and getting the positional advantage. But we're more scared about hands that have got at least 18 or 20 points. And our opponent definitely has some of those, but those, I guess, don't technically involve... Anyway, so if our opponent has a 6 in their hand, then there's a high potential for our opponent to have a 6, and if our opponent does have a 6, they very well might have a 16-point hand, and if we give 2 points to that, it's going to be an 18-point hand, and all of a sudden they'll have position on us. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. And there's a good chance that if our opponent does have 16 points, we can still overtake them over the course of the next 2 hands to get to 18 first. So if we're not playing an ace, then we're either playing 4s or jacks, and my sort of natural reaction is to play the jack here, and that's mostly because I want to keep the 4s for playability, and also I'm a little bit worried about our opponent having 3s. So if I just play a 4, opponent plays a 3, then I don't necessarily have a good follow-up. So I don't have any 2s, 3s, or 5s in order to get any extra points if our opponent does get their 2 points for 15. Of course, from our opponent's point of view, if they have 8-3 in hand, then we have to start wondering, what are the rest of their cards and how good is that hand really? Do we mind giving points to it? And this is the thing that I was a bit worried about in the game, but maybe I didn't need to be after all, which is that I don't think there are many strong hands that have 8-3. What was the strongest hand that we could imagine that has 8-3 in it, that involves 8 and 3 is really like the key combo pieces? I mean, our opponent could still have a 16-point hand with an 8 and a 3 in it, but it just wouldn't involve the 3 to a really good extent. And maybe in order to answer that, we have to look at the cut card a little bit. Maybe there are combos that involve the 3 that also combo with the 9. The other thing about our opponent having 3 in hand is that you can sort of start to make some deductions. The deductions I'm thinking are along the lines of, if our opponent has a lot of low cards left in hand, then they would have led one of those. Our opponent definitely doesn't have 3-3 left. If our opponent has 3-3 left, then what are they doing leading the 8 when I could easily play a 7 on it and our opponent doesn't have any follow-up plays? No, you definitely lead a 3 in those situations. And to a less extreme sense, you can think, well, if our opponent had a pair of 3s, they probably would have led one of them over the 8. And a lot of people would even just lead a 3 over an 8, unless they had maybe a pair of 8s. So we can start to sort of make these kinds of deductions. We can't do it too... we can't go into these deductions too deeply because, opponent could be playing a little bit randomly. Or another way to put it is that lots of different people have lots of different strategies. So we can't say for certain that, the best strategy involves always playing a 3 to begin with, and since our opponent played an 8, that means they definitely don't have a 3. No, we can't say that at all. Our opponent is not necessarily playing by any particular set of dictates. So, if our opponent does have some 3s left, are we particularly worried about them? Well, I'm imagining that hands that do have a 3 in them probably have lots of other high cards in them, including mid to high cards that combo mostly with the 8, because the 8 was led. So I'm thinking of 7s and 9s mostly. So for instance, if our opponent has a hand such as 8-8, 4-3, well, that's not very likely because we have 2 4s in our hand. Maybe they could have 8-8, 3, 9, but that hand's terrible. It's only worth 4 points. It's very hard to think of what are good hands here that have a 3 in them that we're really worried about. And for that reason, I think it's correct to play the 4 here. My natural reaction is to play the jack, and if I had another high card, a mid to high card, maybe another 10, it's probably correct to play the jack here, but just undoubling the 4 makes a lot of sense. And I think this is something that I missed out on in the moment. Also, hindsight is 2020. We can't rely on it, of course, but let's move forward. So what happened? Yeah, we got ourselves into a bit of a sticky situation at this point. So opponent played out 8 and 7, which is a really good play because it puts the total on 25, and it means that the other player, the player who didn't play the 8 and the 7, has to play out their 5s, or if they don't have a 5, they have to play out their 2-card combos that make 5, and in those situations, the the opponent, pawn, will get to play the last card the next time around. So our opponent's guaranteed a point. So we had to play our 4 and ace, and then unfortunately, our opponent reveals to us the 6 and the 5, which is either masterful play, or they got lucky, or a little bit of both. I think our opponent's hand was 8-7-6-5, and they led the 8. I don't think I do that very often. I think I more often lead the 7 myself, but you know, opponent showing us some new moves. Very exciting. And our opponent's hand, 8-7-6-5, with the 9 cut, it's a fairly strong hand, right? After this terrible play, where we've given up 6 points to pawn, our opponent's 9-point hand takes them all the way up to 15, and they are in good shape going forward. They're not in a positionally, well, they may be in a positionally advantageous situation, but they are just behind their milestone, which is always precarious. Anyway, I've rambled on, I think, long enough about this first hand. There's plenty of other sort of learning points in this game. I might go over them in the future, or just on my own. But I hope you enjoyed that and got something out of it, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.